For many Americans, the global highlight of 1969 was NASA's Apollo moon landing on July 20th. During the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a fascinating contest in space exploration. The Russians led with the first satellite on October 4, 1957. America followed with the first human in space on May 5, 1961. John Kennedy's famous exhortation to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth on May 25, 1961, began an equilibrated rivalry that symbolized the basic political and military rivalries of the bipolar world during the Cold War. The American decision to send a man to the moon by decade's end derived from a fear that Soviet space achievements gave the Russians a technological edge over the United States. The ill-fated invasion of Cuba in April 1961 and the erection of the Berlin Wall in August 1961 heightened American anxiety. Cuban and Berlin diplomatic crises in 1962 ushered the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. A long-term objective also existed, with designs for the manned space mission. Although guidelines gave only a 5-year deadline to achieve America's Apollo moon mission, no programs had yet to produce an American spacewalk, the rendezvous of 2 orbital vehicles, or the 3-day manned space mission. Such plights were not initially lost on Kennedy, who in 1962 supported a plan to improve technological and scientific achievements in the military sphere of the national security policy. This was a planetary feat of technology and determination witnessed by hundreds of millions of television spectators. The journey had begun on May 25, 1961, when President John F. Kennedy announced before the U.S. Congress that the task of landing an American on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out was necessary for the pride of the nation. The justification was the long Cold War that the United States and its allies had been waging against communism. Following in the steps of Columbus and the other pioneers of international navigation, himself a man of human dimensions and crossing oceans more immense and hostile than those of our own planet, and out of sight of his fellow countrymen, yesterday would happen again during the summer of 1969. This time, the vessel from which humanity would contemplate the far-off and unknown worlds named Earth could well bear, in the sails of its power and audacity, the colors of a celestial odyssey, more than an odyssey, an act of faith in a better world. The Apollo project, for it was indeed a project that was aimed at a precise goal and defined by means of a specific time frame, was not, however, inspired by mere utility or disinterested prestigious objectives. The scattering of humankind off into space was foreseen around the dawn of the space age by several cosmic visionary authors who had fostered advanced thought during the first years of this century. When Kennedy formulated the American political space choice, the great preceding studies that technologies had realized between 1957 and 1961 had clarified the extent of the distance that separated the USA and the USSR in the brand new prompt and so strategic exploration of the extra-atmospheric spatial environment. The Russians had launched the Lunar project, which resulted, after several space missions or failures, in the first soft lunar landing on August 31, 1966. The goal of the United States project was clear: to produce a powerful and visible demonstration in which would be manifested the full availability of technologies and economic resources that the American government could make fall upon such precise objectives. The Apollo program was conceived in the mid-1960s in a period when the United States was at last able to concentrate its resources on civilian as well as military objectives. Plans for a manned lunar landing were already under discussion in the early 1960s. After the initial shock of the pioneering Russian space achievements that began with the first Sputnik and culminated with the first manned flight, the United States responded with the announcement by President Kennedy on May 25, 1961, of its objective to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This was indeed a missile-type response to the perceived menace of the Soviet boost in space, even though manned spaceflight was at that time of little military significance. But the competition between the two superpowers was then at its apogee. Given the relative levels of inertia of the two industrial military complexes, it is surprising that the United States, with relatively little space experience, was able to succeed where at least two better-informed nations had drawn back. Prior to President Kennedy's decision, several administrators of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had stated openly that NASA was capable of landing a man on the moon. Neither the U.S. Air Force nor America's principal aerospace companies shared that view. Both had their favored alternatives, Dinosaur or the USAF Lunar Glider and Lunar Lander. But President Kennedy, after overruling his misgivings about the advisability of a moon landing program, didn't bow to the Air Force. He gave NASA unquestioned leadership in matters of space. At the beginning of 1961, when President John F. Kennedy promised his nation and the world that a man would be sent to the moon and brought back, and that all this would happen before the end of the decade, the technical tools to do this did not exist yet. Even to reach the space surrounding the Earth, several technological barriers had to be overcome, not in the least the development of powerful engines that could operate in the vacuum of space, and were capable of delivering their load with the required precision in velocity and direction as is necessary to follow the prescribed orbit. But the challenge of landing on another celestial body, even if only a moon as close to the Earth as our own, and returning to Earth in such a short period was far beyond the research that had been done so far. Nevertheless, great industrial and scientific organizations and thousands of enthusiastic and skilled scientists and technicians were dedicated to meeting the task and achieving the goals set by their president. The whole world was watching, and this watchful gaze was accompanied by enthusiasm and admiration and sometimes by fear and mistrust. The year 1969 would mark one of the very few cases in the history of mankind in which an event would become a world event and mobilize people, independent of the ideological and political camp they belonged to. Preparations for Apollo 11. The decision to use the Saturn V to accomplish a manned moon landing was announced on July 11, 1962. However, the decision itself was based on capabilities that existed only on paper. The initial launch vehicle studies and design forerunners by the Army's Ballistic Missile Agency and the Air Force Office of Space Systems were the basis for NASA's early efforts. After its formal establishment as a National Aeronautics and Space Administration laboratory in 1960, the Marshall Space Flight Center was requested by both the White House and the Department of Defense to make a comparison or trade-off among the available proposals for further exploration of space. With that as a primary mission, Marshall undertook the Saturn V studies, along with the department's use of the various military launch vehicles. In its study and subsequent decision to proceed with a new launch vehicle development which would become the Saturn V, it relied heavily on basic science and technology advances, along with enhanced operational concepts and economic analyses. The decision was primarily made to push back the limits of our technological capabilities and to show the world the will and the ability of our democratic free enterprise system. Selection of crew members. Other astronauts trained for the venture were backup crew members astronauts Charles Conrad Jr., Richard F. Gordon Jr., and Alan L. Bean, plus astronauts James A. Lovell Jr. and William A. Anders, who were backup commander and backup lunar module pilot for the second lunar landing mission. Anders was scheduled to accompany Armstrong and Aldrin on their flight to the moon until it was decided that he, as a civilian astronaut, should wait until a later mission. The Apollo mission astronauts had between 2,000 and 5,000 hours of flying experience. Armstrong had served with NASA from 1955 to 1962, but was granted a leave of absence to join the rocket research project. Aldrin and Collins were serving as astronauts, their disciplines in the development of the rendezvous technique being supplemented by a knowledge of the solar wind. The experience of many of the others included fighter pilot, instructor, and test pilot ratings during service in the Air Force or Navy. Once the evaluation of the astronauts was achieved, The choice of a crew was made according to each astronaut's compatibility with his crewmates, his professional qualifications, previous experience, and adaptability of character for interpersonal relations. The crew of Apollo 11, from left to right, Lunar Module pilot Buzz Aldrin, Command Module pilot Michael Collins, and Mission Commander Neil Armstrong, the first human to set foot on the moon. Unlike the other crew members, Armstrong took most of the photographs during their visit to the moon, so there is only one photograph of him actually on the moon. The other photo is of him reflected in the visor of Aldrin's helmet. Until he joined the Apollo program in 1962, Armstrong had established himself as a thoroughly reliable and competent pilot and a well-respected engineer. He had also proven himself to be a skilled test pilot, completing 78 flights in the X-15 rocket plane at speeds of up to 4,000 miles per hour. In addition, Armstrong was familiar with the technology of space travel, for he had flown 2 Gemini missions. He was initially the backup commander for Apollo 8 and then became the backup commander for Apollo 11. As an Apollo 11 astronaut, Armstrong retained much of his test pilot spirit. When the lunar module, the Eagle, quickly used up too much fuel during the landing, the astronauts had to guide the 9,000-pound moonship by hand to a new landing site, which turned out to be an area of boulders up to 5 feet across and 15 feet high. Armstrong would later confide that I felt that the nearness of the unknown boulders and the growing dust cloud made a hasty takeoff seem like a good idea. If the lunar module could not lift off, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the moon forever. But even though he was keeping a wary eye on the fuel gauge, Armstrong's voice was confident and steady as he ordered Aldrin to start the takeoff. When the lunar module, named the Eagle, was just seconds away from touchdown, the astronauts found that their autopilot was bringing them down toward a crater full of large boulders. Armstrong had to assume manual control of the ship to find a suitable place to land. Like an amazing number of great events in human history, the first moon landing wasn't just an achievement of a great human being. It was a huge teamwork in which hundreds of thousands of people played different roles. But as usual, brave astronauts get most of the credit, and of those space pioneers, the first who stepped on the moon, Neil A. Armstrong, is clearly the most famous. He was born on August 5, 1930, in a small town, Wapakoneta, in the state of Ohio, and lived on a farm near the city. He learned to fly at 14 before he got his driver's license by working in a meadow for an entire summer, saving money to pay for the lessons. He received an aeronautical engineering degree from Purdue University and later a degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Southern California. He served as a naval pilot from 1949 to 1952 in the Korean War and accumulated over 500 hours in flight. In 1955, he became a test pilot for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor of NASA. And in his career, he flew many different planes. In 1962, he was selected to become an astronaut and to command the Gemini 8 mission, during which, for the first time in history, he successfully docked his capsule to an unmanned target vehicle. However, a malfunction turned the mission into one of the most serious accidents that any NASA key mission had. In 1969, he commanded the Apollo 11 mission. After his return to Earth, a letter was sent to him in which was written, "We believe the Apollo 11 mission is the supreme achievement of man's mobility, perceptive skills, and indomitable courage in overcoming challenges." Armstrong approved the character and closed the letter, adding, "It was great to hear from you, and I want to seize upon the occasion to thank for the excellent guidance and navigation provided for the Apollo missions. From here on Earth, I have been amazed by the ability to solve difficult problems and to provide the solutions that made the success of the missions possible. We in the space program marvel at the progress of various technologies, including LiDAR, infrared sensors, and many others." The desire to chase another professional challenge was one of the main reasons for his decision to retire from NASA. It took 3 days for the 3 astronauts to reach the moon. They were traveling in the command module, where all the equipment was located. The lunar module was folded up and was connected to the command module in a number of places by metal bars called girders. For most of the journey to the moon, the astronauts were able to see only the stars and the dark shapes of the two modules. Occasionally, they could also see the Earth. One of the astronauts was always awake. One of his main jobs was to talk to the people in Houston, telling them details about the journey and about what the astronauts could see. As the spaceship passed behind the moon, the people on Earth could not see or hear it or communicate with the astronauts for about 30 minutes. This happened every 2 hours. At other times, the command module was traveling too fast for the technicians in Houston to communicate with the astronauts immediately. In all, the astronauts and the technicians in Houston had an opportunity to talk for only 9 hours out of the 3-day journey to the moon. The countdown for Apollo 11's launch commenced on July 13, 1969. It was a generally nominal countdown. The weather forecast was favorable. The fueling operations were conducted with only minor problems. At the 1-minute mark, the Saturn V's fifth tower, which had been hooped and held at the base of the stack, was pulled back to its relaxed parking area. 10 seconds later, the guidance system was go for launch. The spacecraft test conductor gave a final 3- readout to the crew in the form of the launch vehicle's status, and then wished Commander Armstrong good luck and Godspeed. Armstrong responded with, "Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight." With 10 seconds left in the count, tiny blue flames began flickering from the base of the launch vehicle, and the water deluge system beneath Pad 39A came on simultaneously. The 5 engines of the first stage ignited and began building up to their full thrust. The propellant tanks were pressurized and the explosive bolts that held the vehicle in place were ignited. Amid earth-shaking roar and fury, the giant rocket began its final journey out of mission control. The flight azimuth was carefully controlled during the initial phase of the launch to ensure that the velocity gained, plus the Earth's velocity of 460 meters per second, would sum to the precise value required for the trans-lunar injection maneuver. This procedure, called guidance, navigation, and control, was performed by the Saturn V's instrument unit. The attitude of the vehicle was also controlled by the guidance computer and the external parts of the launch vehicle itself, which were turned so as to control the path in space described by the Saturn V. The SIC stage fired for 2 minutes 41 seconds. During the final seconds of its performance, this stage flew a diagonal, curved path away from the vertical earthward direction and back into it again to ensure that it would not fall into an inhabited area. When the SIC stage had completed its mission, it was jettisoned. 2 pyrotechnic cords were fired to break the connections between the spent stage and the partially squeezed-in interstage, and the single J2 engine in the second stage was ignited at an altitude of about 68.5 kilometers and at a velocity of about 6,047 kilometers per hour. Unlike most other space missions, the Apollo lunar timing and sequence was conducted in 2 halves. The first inserting the spacecraft into orbit about the moon, and the second being descent and landing on the lunar surface. Each required precise management and operation of the lunar module to bring off successfully, just as did launch and insertion to Earth orbit. On July 19th, en route to the moon, the Apollo 11 astronauts first fired the main engine of their command module to slow the spacecraft, allowing it to be captured by the moon's gravity and enter lunar orbit. Circling the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin then transferred to the lunar module, while Collins remained in orbit in the command module. After descending to an elevation of 50,000 feet, Armstrong took over manual control, flying beyond the landing zone area by a considerable distance before establishing a leftward trajectory to the chosen landing site. With a measured descent to 20,000 feet, the flight continued under automatic control, and the Apollo 11 lunar module dropped to 400 feet and descended at about 10 meters per second until, looking out the visual window, the commander decided it was time to go further. Upon his call, and touching the descent engine switch on the control panel with a firm blow, he disabled the automatic control and took manual control of the descent himself. The lunar module then started flying horizontally over the lunar surface and controlled the descent from there to the landing. During its descent, the lunar module was on the margin of actually having enough fuel to land. When a fuel low-level sensor activated just above the programmed cutoff, Buzz Aldrin said contact light, indicating that one of the footpads had touched the moon's surface. He then said shut down to Armstrong. "Okay, engine stop," the lander's descent controller called out. "ACA out of detent." "Out of detent," Armstrong replied. "Mode control both auto, descent engine command, override off, engine arm off, 413 is in." Then, sounding more relieved, Aldrin said, "We copy you down, Eagle. Houston Tranquility Base here," Armstrong radioed. "The Eagle has landed." "Roger, Tranquility," the flight controller radioed back. "We copy you on the ground. You've got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." Some 30 seconds after landing, Buzz Aldrin stood and pulled a D-ring to release an escape mechanism so the ascent stage might blast the astronauts away from an unlandable moon. The module, resting on shock-absorbing struts, appeared on television monitors in mission control. Because of an oversight in mission planning, Neil Armstrong had to manually pinpoint the Eagle landing spot in the last seconds, diverting around boulders and a crater for a safe touchdown. Accordingly, the 47 hours, 43 minutes get completely expended the landing portion of the lunar module, misbalancing the rest of the mission plan in a way that endangered the completion of the major mission objectives. After the excitement of the first moonwalk, Aldrin and Armstrong took a successful nap. But then they began to feel the combined effects of fatigue, a sleepless lunar day, and a series of mishaps culminating in one of devastating impact. The situation not only interrupted the scientific work of the first moonwalkers, but called for a change of procedures in subsequent moon landings. Neil Armstrong's first steps, one small step for man, Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Our EVA preparations are relatively slow and methodical, both of us being very careful in adjusting the hose and straps on the backpacks that will keep us alive on the lunar surface. The mobility and flexibility of the suits make everything take longer than I had planned. The voice comes calling that it is time to go outside, and Neil goes first, following his checklist to the lanyard that opens the door of the spacecraft. He crawls through the hatchway and, using the handles fixed to the front of his PLSS, climbs down the ladder to the surface below. I stop thinking about anything except my immediate tasks and concentrate only on moving exquisitely slowly through the required series of steps, making certain that everything I have to do is completed before the 15 minutes of allowable time have passed. Once I begin to move, there seems to be a possibility I may indeed be able to perform these tasks, and before I am too far from the Eagle, those voices come booming in. "Very good, Buzz. We have been monitoring your efficiency. We think that you are accomplishing all tasks and that your pace is a leisurely one. You have accumulated almost 50 minutes of consumable." EVA and experiments. Before the walk on the moon, most experiments had been installed on the front side and platforms and on the central station. The sampling scoop carrying the television camera, X-ray spectrometer and alpha particle backscatter instrument was prepared for operation by assembly of the modular parts and preliminary checkout of moving parts. The television camera on the axial scientific equipment bay was swiveled to look at it. At the same time, the soil mechanics surface sampler was assembled from its modular parts, and the heat flow experiment package was unpacked. The seismometer was readied by the removal of the cover, and the various experiments carried on the portable life support system were activated. First, the solar wind composition experiment was performed. A piece of aluminum foil 15 inches square that had been exposed to lunar vacuum during the descent was deployed on a removable panel so that the sun was in the middle of the panel. The astronauts then returned to the mesa to leave the remainder of the aluminum foil package, a small solar wind detector, and exposure restraint on the LM structure. The laser-ranging retroreflector on the central station and the corner cube laser reflector that also acted as part of a communication system between the LM and the central station were also fixed to the LM structure. The portable life support system was then re-released into a parking position attached to a ladder strut. Finally, the solar wind experiment was turned through 360 degrees. so that its shadow pointed at a specific azimuth, and the package was then dropped on the soil. Returning to Earth. The lunar lander returned to the command module. That good old Collins was still orbiting the moon. It was time to get off this rock. The experience of being in black space had made them homesick for the greens and blues of Earth. However, any thought of packing it in was also replaced with the thought of reuniting with Collins and performing the task of staying alive, getting back to Earth. The lander approached the command module from behind, then alongside, in front of, and then beneath the command module. The astronauts then ignited the lander engine, forcing it to pull away from the command module. This maneuver transformed a two-stage vehicle into a one-stage vehicle with the CSM as the payload to bring home to Earth. However, this maneuver had to happen at just the right place and at just the right time. If the lander pulled back too late, the lander engine would detonate and kill the command module crew as well as itself. The engine cut off and the lander engines were no longer needed. They dropped off. The now empty lander was jettisoned. That pretty planet Earth was growing. The god of this planet it's now up to this crew. The beauty of the slowly rotating Earth grows larger and larger, then splash. The next critical maneuver was the liftoff from the lunar surface to lunar orbit. The LM contained a rocket motor with a single nozzle that provided the thrust to accomplish this. This motor was the same motor used in the ascent stage of the LM to make the final descent. The transfer engine operated nominally, and at approximately 74 hours mission elapsed time, the final lunar launch occurred. The crew, vehicle and equipment were established in near continuous daylight and high temperature exposure for the first time in 63 hours. The first extravehicular activity lasted 2 hours. The cabin was cooled to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabin atmosphere continued to be recalibrated at a pressure of 6.2 psia. Food and water intake remained at normal levels, with waste managed by the urine and fecal collection device. The quality of the sleep effectively ended discussion of pre-sleep activities accomplished at 78 hours mission elapsed time. The lunar module had a battery to store energy from the fuel cells. This battery was recharged from the fuel cells before each EVA, and the stored electricity was used during the EVA. The operations on the lunar surface were so widespread that a substantial percentage of the power reserves in the ascent module were used. After the LM had lifted off from the lunar surface, the ascent engine was used to send the astronauts into lunar orbit. The command module was in orbit around the moon at an altitude of 60 by 170 nautical miles and a velocity of 3,600 feet per second when the lunar module ascent stage engine burn was initiated. The impact point remained nearly constant at 10.4 degrees east latitude and 127.5 degrees west longitude throughout the liftoff phase. After a few very minor course corrections implemented by the crew during this orbit, the burn was initiated. The burn was initiated in lunar orbit and lasted for about 10 minutes, causing a delta V of approximately 7,500 feet per second. The crew of Apollo 11 began re-entry procedures about 4 hours and 40 minutes after leaving lunar orbit. The service propulsion system was to be shut down and the command module placed in the proper attitude to maintain a pre-calculated lift vector that would generate controlled lift during re-entry. The high-gain antenna would be used during entry to provide more reliable communications with the Earth. This would be jettisoned at 45,000 feet altitude, having served its purpose. The frequency agile S-band system was inoperative, and only the S-band Omni antenna was usable. Re-entry speed would be 36,194 feet per second, the fastest any humans had ever traveled. The spacecraft was protected against the speed and heat of re-entry by its heat shield, made of brazed stainless steel honeycomb filled with phenolic epoxy resin. Ablation material ablated or burned away the resin and kept the temperature of the heat shield at not much more than 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. As it re-entered the denser portion of Earth's atmosphere, the spacecraft generated radio interference that blacked out the radio signal to Earth. They would not have to re-establish communications. They would be recovered by ships and helicopters tracking the splashdown point. Safe return home. Astronauts Howard Houston, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins returned safely to Earth on July 24, 1969. They landed in the Pacific Ocean, 13 miles from the recovery ship. The three were picked up and taken to Hawaii, where they arrived on the USS Hornet. There, they were quarantined for 3 weeks to ensure that no diseases that live on the moon contaminated them. The entire world was so proud and relieved that the three made it back, that the US Congress gave them honors and medals. During their entire trip, they had been wearing a specific type of suit and shoes, which gathered small samples of moon dust for examination. After they landed, they were not allowed to keep the suits because of the quarantine period, so they changed, got cleansed, and put on heavy protective clothing. All the items and spaceship equipment that were possibly contaminated were thrown away. Only Apollo 11's flight data file and the 3 astronauts were allowed to re-enter the planet. The large plane that held the flight data file and the astronauts landed in Houston, Texas, where the 3 men had a large parade with celebrations and special events in their honor. Not only did they make it back home safely, they had proved to the world and beyond that man can land, walk on, and return safely from the moon. Achievements and legacy. 21st July 1969 saw the first manned moon landing. The Eagle, the lunar module of the Apollo 11, landed on the moon's surface. On 20th July 1969, American Neil Armstrong became the first human being to walk on the lunar surface and uttered his now famous words, "That's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind." Fellow astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin also walked on the moon. The mission was deemed a success and a symbol of American capability and can-do spirit. The lunar landing was a part of the space race, which the United States was then engaged in with the Soviet Union. The objectives of the mission were to serve as a catalyst for scientific research and technology development and to inspire the next generation through storytelling and educational support. The first manned moon landing is the United States' single greatest technological achievement of all time. The primary goal of a crewed lunar landing was first articulated by President John F. Kennedy as part of a special message to a joint session of Congress on 25 May 1961. He stated that the landing would take place before this decade is out. The mission came only 6 weeks after an unforgettable and catastrophic event that unfolded on national television. On 3rd March 1969, the Apollo 9 crew, James A. McDivitt, David R. Scott, and Russell L. Schweickart, made their successful 10-day Earth orbital flight. After local checkout, service propellant loading, and inflation of the landing reaction control systems, the Saturn V launch vehicle lifted off and went into an Earth parking orbit. A continuous radio frequency link established capability for ground command and voice communication through the launch vehicle up to 10 seconds before the cutoff of the third stage at 11 minutes and 42 seconds after liftoff. Ranger 6, in turn, returned 4,308 images, 4 of the general area and 10 of the schedule. However, the mission was not without problems. 3 premature signals were detected indicating gas leaks, possible contamination sources identified, and respective course probabilities assessed. The selected landing sites were surveyed again for possible environmental or spacecraft anomalies. Accounting for these additional data, the in-flight channel, a parity counter, and the in-flight communication system in the configuration are fully qualified. Technological advancements. It took a secret cooperative effort on the part of the United States to simulate the moon landing that Apollo 11's astronauts would undertake some months later. President Nixon had okayed the effort, which had the blessing of Soviet leaders. Telescopic photography and orbital photography from unmanned satellites were on the increase. The Soviet Union had some very limited success landing pictures on the moon and orbiting Venus, and the United States had flown by Mars. The stage was now set for Apollo 11 to take these next giant steps in space for mankind. 4 additional Apollo moon landings would be able to follow, but disbelief and cost-cutters would take the landing program in a different direction. The Apollo 11 technology represented something in the ballpark of 5 decades of technology development, from idealized theoretical calculations and predictions to elements that burned up on entry into the Martian or Venusian atmospheres in the very late 1960s. Most fixed and exchangeable parts were made from elements lighter than air. Onboard computers came in a bulky size, but for those times they wielded a very respectable calculating punch. In parallel, most of the above advances were old hat in varying degrees to military aviation, passenger transportation, and business machines. It was a singular and extraordinary moment woven into the fabric of time for all eternity, encapsulating the sentiment which best characterized the impact of the first moon landing. Millions of ordinary people shared the thousands of launch and landing experiences, but its impact went beyond the personal to dramatically and permanently enrich the culture of the world. The milestone of the century, the greatest achievement of man, and the fulfillment of a dream are other phrases used to sum up the moon landing's religious mystical side, which captivated the human spirit. In its totality, the moon landing produced in human beings an irrational but delightful sense of wonder that made them think temporarily of other things and, for a moment, drew them closer together and to more important matters. If the first moon landing produced a sense of higher understanding, it also produced, to a lesser extent, an evaluation of the Earth from the moon by the more elevated viewers of man's technological and scientific works. Although the other amateur observers insisted that they had seen the American flag, it merely recorded that Lunar Orbiter 2 had photographed Surveyor 1 and the elongated shadows of the American flag and flagstaff. Apollo 11's successful mission influenced many people around the globe. Some reciprocated by sending congratulatory telegrams, gifts, or letters to the crew of Apollo 11 or to their respective NASA centers. The crew of Apollo 11 read the Bible verse that was left on the lunar surface by Eagle's crew. Psalms 8:9, "You have made him a little lower than the angels and have crowned him with glory and honor." The United States flag that Apollo 11 brought to the lunar surface was designated the United States Banner of Peace and Ship of State. It was then sent for preservation and public display. In addition, the astronauts received medals, decorations, and other honors from the United States and other countries. Americans celebrated Apollo 11's success generously and jubilantly, often expressing feelings of national pride and solidarity. But human beings in many other countries were also pleased about what had taken place, and the moonwalking viewers reported that many people abroad had been jubilant as well. A few days after the mission had ended, President Nixon said during the U.S. reception for foreign governments and scientific and diplomatic communities that Apollo 11 was one mission of all mankind. "We are proud that this year will go down in history as the year in which man first walked on the moon. The achievement was one of the most significant accomplishments in the history of the human race. In outer space, as well as at home among men," the Vice President said, "our goal must be to create the basis for man's lasting greatness." The flight of Apollo 11 stands as one of the landmark events in the history of humanity. In achieving this feat, the American people consummated long-nurtured aspirations. It is not simply the destination, but the journey. It is the process of achieving a dream that is worth cherishing, for not everything arises through happenstance. No, the first lunar landing is a story of faith, imagination, courage, determination, and the unsullied belief that the people of the world can be enriched by the achievements of their fellow men. It is a story whose principles were not alone in benefiting from the fruits of their labor, but rather they acted with the knowledge that they were representatives of a larger humanity. Returning to Earth, the Apollo 11 crew employed the special vantage point of those who have gazed on Earth from the moon. They were man enough to confess that they could share with their countrymen and their fellow Earthlings their universal empathy, as well as their unique perspective. Upon return, the crew acted as suppliants, men willing to tell a silent world what they had seen. Thus, the first manned lunar landing becomes a timeless, universal event. It is one of those infrequent occurrences that become etched in the annals of humankind, and that will occupy the thoughts of mankind for as long as humans walk their Earth. And it is worth remembering that it was the result of long years of toil of thousands of humble, unknown workers who made the dream a dynamic reality. It is only in the rarest of instances that the truly significant episodes in human affairs find their reflection in the glassy surface of their time. History's zeniths are typically hidden from contemporary view, the view only becoming clear in the tranquility of the years to follow. For Neil Armstrong's walk upon the lunar surface during the final summer of the 20th century's first half, no powerful telescope was required to recognize the significance of the event. Mankind saw immediately the step that had been taken by one of its members. But significance is one thing and understanding is quite another. The century's databanks may yet have to provide the perspective that the precious hours of the days and the weeks following the morning when the Eagle had landed supplied for the initial few careers that were anxious to delve into the collected evidence. With 30 years having formed the bridge that joins the event to the sophisticated era in which this book was being written and read, some of the significance of Armstrong's first step and the rest of the Apollo 11 mission that produced that step can be understood with respect to its role and its effect, not just as an event per se. The lunar module called itself Eagle in recognition of the United States of America's national emblem, and it carried with it two representatives from planet Earth. Eagle's commander was Neil Armstrong of Wapakoneta, Ohio, and his companion was Edwin Eugene Buzz Aldrin Jr., a native of Montclair, New Jersey. The almost sea-like tranquility base upon which the Eagle landed, where the two pilots would pass the first day of their extravehicular activity, and the crew would live through the first of the 2 long eastern days of their mission, was located at 0 degrees 41 minutes east longitude and 23 degrees 26 minutes latitude, to the question of where to go. That had been put by President Kennedy to the combined group of special advisors appointed to help with and manage the U.S. exploration of outer space. Reality had been the focus of post-Sputnik 1 soul-searching. The event that answered the nation's question of why do this occurred on the 20th day of July in the climactic year of 1969, with its reverberating impact touching many aspects of life and thought upon planet Earth. 3 cheers for the achievements of the Eagle and its gallant crew. 3 cheers for the inspiration that the event created, providing to its antecedents a tangible symbol of their dreams and to later generations a tangible symbol of earthly possibilities that their age might someday be able to provide. As we reflect on the incredible journey of Apollo 11 and mankind's first steps on the moon, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the most significant moment in this historic mission? Drop your comments below and let's discuss. Don't forget to like this video if you found it interesting, subscribe for more captivating historical moments, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our next exploration into the past. Join us as we continue to explore the pivotal moments that changed history.